How you guys doing? Good. Good morning to those of you that are watching online this morning, wherever you're at. It is so good to be with you guys. We are in a series called The Rest of the Story. And for the last couple of weeks, Pastor Steve has kind of set us up to where we're going. And last week he talked about work and the fact that our value doesn't come from our work, but the fact is that we work because of our value, right? So he asked me this week to speak on the rest portion of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11. And so I have come to this conclusion. Confession, okay? Are you guys good with that if I make a confession? Okay, this topic that we're about to talk about, I'm not very good at. So I am convinced that there are times when Steve asks me to cover a specific topic that I am passionate about, or that maybe I'm good at, or something that I have knowledge about, right? Then I think there are these other times like today where he asked me to speak on a topic because he knows I'm not very good at it, and he thinks if I speak on it that I'll be better at it. Do you know why that is? Because I don't consider myself a hypocrite, and so if I stand here and encourage you to do something, I have to do it myself, right? Is that not how it works, right? Would you guys respect me if I told you to do something and I don't do it myself? So I think sometimes, when I'm speaking on a topic that I'm not real good at, there's a lot of preparation and a lot of study, and I have to look at myself before I can share what the Word of God has to say. And so I believe that this is one of those times. And as we talk about the topic of rest, I'm being honest with you and saying that I struggle with it. I do. On Tuesday morning, Anita and I are leaving for 6 weeks and going on a sabbatical. And our church several years ago has instituted a policy that after every 7 years of work, our pastors need to go away for 6 weeks to just kind of rest and refresh. So after 18 plus years now, this will be our second time going. And so I'm excited about it, and I'm scared to death of it, if I'm honest. Because what am I going to do, right? I'm not allowed to work for 6 weeks, and that's really hard for me. And I struggle with even sometimes just taking a single day off a week. And I would venture to say that there's probably a lot of you this morning that have the same struggle. You don't have to raise your hand or say it out loud, but how many of you have trouble checking in with work on your day off? How many of you feel like your house always has to be neat and in order? You have to check your phone constantly because there's something that's important that might be happening that you might miss out on, right? Or that you're supposed to do. Or I'm bad about projects and things needing to be fixed, and I always have to be fixing or producing or productive, right? Nobody else identifies with that, right? It's just me. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to speak to myself this morning, and you guys just sit back and listen, okay? Good? All right, so Matthew chapter 11. Verses 28 to 30 is our theme verses for this series. And I know you guys know this all by heart because you've heard it so many times already, but I'm going to put it on the screen for you one more time, all right? Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so last week, Pastor Steve talked about the yoke and about rest and where our value and our worth comes from. And so today we're going to talk about the finding rest for your souls that Jesus promises. But as we start to unpack this, what I want us to do is I want us to go back to the Old Testament, to the words of the prophet Jeremiah. And we're going to look at Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, because this principle of rest that Jesus is talking about, God put in place from the beginning. And so Jeremiah 6:16 says this, "This is what the Lord says, stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." Same phrase that Jesus said, right? You'll find rest for your souls. Jeremiah 6, he says, if you do this, you'll find rest for your souls. The last part of the verse. "But you said, we will not walk in it." How many parents do we have in the house today? How many of you are watching online and that feels like a conversation with your kids, right? You want to be successful? You want to do good in school? Just take your time, write neatly, right? Do it in order, and you'll get good grades. Or You want these privileges? Do these chores, clean your room, whatever it is, and you'll get this. Now, most of our kids just don't do it, right? How many of our kids stand up and say, I'm not doing it? And that's exactly what's happening here is God said, do this and you will have rest. And they said, we're not going to do it. But it shouldn't be shocking to us because if you read through a lot of the interactions between God and Israel, Israel is known for its rebellion, right? They wandered in the wilderness for 40 extra years because they were rebellious. There were a lot of blessings and promises that they were given that they didn't receive because they were rebellious. And so for them to, in this passage, say, you know what, I'm not going to do it, it's not really surprising. And I think we feel like that as parents, but if we're honest, most of us act like that too. We may not be as blatant to say, I'm not going to do it, but we just don't do it, right? So this ancient path that Jeremiah is talking about, these ancient ways were the paths for rest for the soul. And so there was a few things that were set up. There was the principle of Sabbath rest, the work 6 days and rest 1. There were sabbatical weeks, and then there were sabbatical years. And so the principle was this: you work 6 days, you rest 1. 3 times a year, there is a festival that is a week long that is meant to be a time of rest. And then every 7th year is a year that you don't plant crops and you don't work the land. You plant and work for 6 years and you let the land and yourself rest for a 7th year. It was this whole thing that was in place for the good of the individual and the good of the land. And so these vocally rebellious Israelites didn't walk in the paths that God laid out for them. And so we see, and even just a few chapters over in Jeremiah prophesies about what is going to happen. And so the children of Israel are taken into captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And the scripture says that during the 70 years that Israel was in captivity to Babylon, that the land rested. Well, 70 years seems like a long time, doesn't it? It is a long time. I mean, for us, that's a lifetime. But the truth of the matter is that for 490 years, the Israelites refused the principle of letting the land rest every 7th year. And so if you take the 7th year out of 490 and you multiply it, it equals 70 years. Because they did not rest, let the land rest during that 490-year time frame, they were sent into captivity for 70 years so that the principle of rest could come on the land. Now, was that good for the land? Was it good for the people? 70 years of bondage and captivity and service to the Babylonians? If they'd have obeyed, wouldn't have happened, right? And so they couldn't obey the 7th year sabbatical. There was a study that was done by a Finnish university a few years ago on the principle of vacation. And they discovered that if you take vacation, each day that you take vacation, you become happier, you become more refreshed or fulfilled up until day 8. And on day 8, there is like this peak of happiness and enjoyment that just plateaus. So if you take 10 days or 12 days, it doesn't really change it. But if you take less than 8 days, you're not getting the full capacity of what you could have. And so they discovered that 8 days is the magic number for a vacation. What's interesting is when the principle of the feast weeks was set up for Israel, they began and ended with a Sabbath, which meant that that week-long festival totaled 8 days. Do you think that's a coincidence? I don't either. God knew what he was doing when he designed us. When he set up these paths for Israel, he knew what he was doing. And so 8 days was this magical number, if you will, for rest and for happiness and for peace of mind. So we as Americans are good and we've got that principle, right? No. 14% of Americans take more than 2 weeks vacation per year. 37% take less than 7 days total for the year. I'm not talking 7 days at a time, but 7 days for the year. So let's go to the Sabbath principle of working 6 days and resting 1. That one's easy, right? I mean, it's hard to take a year off. Can you imagine taking a year off? I can't. Can you imagine taking 8 days off? It's imaginable, but it's hard to do, right? I mean, the statistics show that we're not good at it. So working 6 days and taking one off's got to be easy, doesn't it? No? It's not. And I think that's true for us. But here's what happened in Israel. This is a paraphrase that I'm giving from Amos chapter 8. And they actually asked the question, when will this festival be over? When will the Sabbath be over so that we can go back to market, so that we can sell, and so that we can make money? And not only were they in a hurry to go back and make money, but that passage actually breaks down the fact that they were being dishonest and they were cheating the poor. And they couldn't wait for the Sabbath rest day to be over so they could go back and do it again. More modern time. Andrew Sullivan, who is a writer, wrote in an essay for the New York Times Magazine. Now, this magazine article title was, "I Used to Be a Human Being." He said, "The Sabbath, the Jewish institution co-opted by Christianity, was a collective imposition of relative silence, a moment of calm to reflect on our lives under the light of eternity." This was its original purpose. It helped define much of Western public life once a week for centuries, only to dissipate with scarcely a passing regret into the commercial cacophony of the past couple decades. It reflected a now battered belief that a sustained spiritual life is simply unfeasible for most mortals without these refuges from noise and work to buffer us and remind us who we really are. Because we went from being a human being to a human doing. Because we're identified by our work. And so, I don't know about you, but I remember as a kid, almost everything was closed on Sunday, right? Anybody remember that? You didn't go to the mall, you didn't go to the store because it was closed. There was a lot of gas stations that weren't open. And then gradually, more and more things began to be open, and it became more normal to do the same thing on Sunday that you did every other day of the week. It wasn't an abrupt shift that we really missed it and noticed it, right? It was a gradual thing, and then it was a kind of, oh yeah, I kind of remember, like, where did it go? So the question for us today is, why don't we Sabbath? Why don't we rest? I think one reason that Steve talked about last week is that our identity comes from our work. And if I'm not working, I'm losing my identity. I struggle with that. When I am producing and productive and accomplishing something, I can say, see, look what I did. And we tend to get our value and our worth from that. And when we rest, where's the value that comes in that? How do I get worth in doing essentially nothing, right? And not accomplishing it, almost to the point that I feel guilty because I'm not accomplishing or doing something. Another reason is that we are constantly chasing stuff that we don't need. We're chasing milestones and we're chasing goals, or we're chasing an amount of material possessions and we're always reaching for more. I heard this week that there exists in America 7 square feet of storage space for every person in this country. 7. Now, a bunch of you are sitting saying, I don't even have a storage unit, so how is that possible? All right, do the math. If you don't have one, that means somebody's got a lot, right? There are 7 square feet of storage space for every person in America. That means, it'd be a little bit cramped, but we could house every person in just our storage facilities alone without using housing. But I gotta have a little bit more, right? And that more is not measurable. It's never accomplished. The third reason is we don't trust God. We feel that God needs us and needs us to keep doing in order to accomplish what he wants to be accomplished. And so if I don't do it, God can't do what he needs to do. Sometimes that's because we think too highly of ourselves, but more often than not, it's the fact that we just don't trust God that if I'm not doing something, that things are going to be okay. The fourth reason, I think, is we just don't understand it. We don't understand what rest is meant to be. We don't understand what Sabbath is. And so that's what I want us to dive into today, is understanding what Sabbath is. In order to do that, we're going to go way back in the Old Testament to Exodus, and we're going to look at the 10 Commandments. The commandment about the Sabbath is the fourth commandment, and we're going to look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. And it says this: Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what does it mean to Sabbath? Really? The word Sabbath with a capital S is the Sabbath day that we know as keep the Sabbath holy, right? But it comes from the word Sabbath, lowercase s, which means a few different things, but primarily what I want you to see today is the word Sabbath means to cease, and it means to celebrate. It means to cease and celebrate. And in order to cease, which is to stop, you have to do something, right? You can't stop if you never started. You guys agree? So here's the principle that we are to apply when it comes to our Sabbath. We are to stop work. Just said it in Exodus 20. You are to do no work. We are to stop wanting. It takes care of that always wanting for more, right? And we're to stop worrying. Sabbath is a day that we're to cease all of that other stuff. And then we get to celebrate what we've done. And in order for us to celebrate, we had to accomplish something, right? You work 6 days and you produce and you accomplish and you get to celebrate what you have done. And this principle was introduced long before this chapter in Exodus. If we go back to Genesis, to creation, it says that God for 6 days created. At the end of each day, he looked at creation and he said, what? It is good. And then on the seventh day, he rested. He was able to look back on his work and celebrate. And it's interesting to note that on the seventh day, when essentially God created the Sabbath day, the rest day, he didn't look at it and say, it's good. He set the day and said, it's holy. It's on a whole other level than the everyday work that he did leading up to that. God created, and then he ceased from creating, and he celebrated what he had created. This commandment principle that we read in Exodus about the Sabbath is kind of the middle commandment. And it's in between the first 3 commandments, which are about loving God, and the last 6, which are about loving people. And Jesus said in Mark 12, which we talk about here when we use the phrase real love, real people, Jesus said the commandments come down to loving God and loving people, right? So which commandment does the Sabbath have to do with? It's both. It is the commandment that is in between the commandments about loving God and loving people, because it is about both. Sabbath rest is about resting in the value that God placed within you, not because you do anything to earn it. It's about honoring God and about keeping that day set aside to be holy, to honor him, but it's also about rest. And when, in Exodus, when they lay out the instructions, and here's something that's interesting. This commandment has more explanation than any of the other 10 commandments. Why is that? Do you need explanation on you shouldn't kill or you shouldn't steal? Those are pretty simple and cut and dry, right? And if God had given the command, you need to rest, would that have been enough? Obviously not, because he needed 4 verses to explain to us what that meant and what the reason behind it was. And when he said, you're not to do any work, and neither are your kids, and neither are your servants, or any foreigners that are with you, or your animals. It's about togetherness, that everybody's in this together. It's about relationship. Most of us get pretty irritable and cranky when we're tired, right? Yeah? Resting is for the benefit of your relationships and people around you. Because you are a better person, you're a better parent, you're a better son or daughter, you're a better worker when you're rested. And so God created this commandment in here because it's about our relationship with God and it's about our relationship with people. So the first thing that we need to understand about Sabbath is that Sabbath is for relationship. Sabbath is for relationship. And what's interesting is if we go back to verse 1 of Exodus 20, God starts out by saying this, I am the God that brought you out of Egypt. And then he goes on and he shares what the laws are. And see, here's why this is significant to this commandment. In Egypt, life was about commodity, it was about production, it was about consumption. They not only had storage units, but they had cities to keep their goods because it was that important. And in Egypt, for the Israelites, if they were not healthy and physically strong enough to produce bricks, they had no value. Their value came strictly from what they could produce. And what God is saying is, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, and I'm moving you into something new. And here's what you need to understand. I am about covenant with you, and I am about relationship with you. And your value is not based on what you did in the land of Egypt and about what you could produce, but your value is in who I created you. Sabbath rescues us from thinking that our identity is found in what we do. Sabbath was to rescue the Israelites from thinking we're only as good as what we could produce for Pharaoh and his army and the people of Egypt. And here's what I think many of us need to know today. God is more interested in who you are than what you do. God is more interested in who you are than what you do. And he takes pleasure in the fact that you are who he created you to be. God doesn't take pleasure in the fact that you're working on becoming what somebody else wants you to be, or that you're working on becoming what you think you should be, or working on just accomplishing and doing more to look a certain way. God takes pleasure in the fact that you're who he created you to be. And that's it. That's where your value comes from. And that was not only true of the head of the household, it was true of everyone that lived in the home and worked in the home. The Sabbath was for everyone, and it was about togetherness. All right, so let's jump forward now that we've kind of established the Sabbath being introduced to Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees. And so we just read, we're basing this on Matthew 11, where Jesus is talking about come and find rest. And if you look at a couple of these stories that we're going to talk about, they happen, if you read them, the stories account in Matthew, they're the very next verse. But what I want to do is I want to look at this in Mark chapter 2. It's going to be on the screen for you. And Jesus interacts with the Pharisees a lot on the Sabbath. But a couple of these I just want to point out because I think they're really important. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick up some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is only lawful for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Catch this. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath." What Jesus is telling us here, second thing we need to understand about the Sabbath, is that the Sabbath is a gift for us. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. That means it's a gift. And so what's interesting about this statement is, this two-part statement, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, the second part of his statement was most important to them. When he said that man was not made for the Sabbath, it was because they lived in a culture of legalism, and the rules of the Sabbath and what you did or didn't do were more important than the person. They were more important than the man. The rules of the Sabbath had more value than the person. And what Jesus is saying is, you've got it wrong. You've got it backwards. These people, were not created for this day, but this day was created for them. And so for us in our American culture, we need to understand the first part of the statement, that Sabbath, the gift of rest, was made for us. It's not a burden. It's not a rule. It's not a regulation. It's a gift for us. And we need to understand that today. Rest is not a nuisance. It's not something that gets in the way of productivity. It's not something that gets in the way of accomplishing, but it is a gift to us, and rest makes us better at the things that we are called to do. All right, let's keep going. If you flip to the very next verse, it starts Mark chapter 3. It says, "Another time Jesus was into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. They were watching Jesus to see if they could trip him up. And when he asked him a question, I would say they're probably smart enough to not get caught up themselves, right? So what does Jesus do? He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts because they knew the truth and wouldn't admit it. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. The Pharisees were concerned that Jesus was going to heal on the Sabbath. Did he disappoint them? No, he gave them exactly what they were thinking he was going to do, right? And if we read on and look at the majority of the healings that Jesus performed, guess what? They were on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was Jesus' favorite day to heal. In another instance, there was a man that was crippled laying on his mat. Jesus told him to rise up and walk and to pick up his mat, carry it, and be on his way. Do you think the Pharisees liked that? Not a bit. Do you know why? The Sabbath was created as a law. It was written in the Word of God, and it was very clear that it was a law to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But in the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Pharisees, the rabbis, had created 39 different laws when it came to work and what was not allowed to be done on the Sabbath. Guess who was good at violating these 39 unwritten laws? Jesus. Do you know that it was unlawful to heal on the Sabbath? If you were sick and you were dying, you could be treated to the point that your condition would not worsen or that you would not die, but you could not be treated if it meant making you better. That had to wait for another day. Your life could be saved, but it could not be made better. It could not be made better. Another rule or law that was in those 39 laws was you could not pick up your mat and carry it. And, we can imagine what Jesus was thinking, right? He may have chose these things intentionally, like, I'm going to mess with him. I'm going to tell him to pick up his mat and carry it because they say he can't do it, and I'm going to tell him to do it, right? The Sabbath was such a ritual, like we just talked about, that the value of a person was not more important than the rules of the Sabbath. And Jesus says, no, that's not how this works. They had used the principle of Sabbath as a point of ritual and a point of condemnation, a point of bondage, a point of burden. But God created Sabbath for benefit and for blessing. And Jesus was making this distinction when he said, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to give life or to take it. Jesus was saying that the Sabbath was for healing. It was for life. But ultimately, number 3, the Sabbath is for freedom. The Sabbath is for freedom. Jesus said in Luke chapter 4 that I have come to what? Proclaim the good news, right? Bring freedom to prisoners. Bring sight to the blind. What better day for those things to happen than on the Sabbath? And when Jesus taught in the synagogues, when he performed healing miracles, that's what he was doing, was he was bringing healing and freedom to a man that couldn't walk, to a man that couldn't open his eyes, to a man that couldn't use his hands. He was bringing freedom to those who were oppressed and those who were beat down. This law was made for freedom. And we don't often think that laws are made for freedom, right? But in reality, most laws are put there for us to know how things operate. All of us as parents put boundaries on our kids and say, if you operate within the boundaries, you have freedom, right? When you drive a car, there are laws of the road, and when you operate those within those boundaries or laws, you can operate a car freely. Oftentimes, we think that laws are for restriction and for burden. This law in particular, the law of Sabbath, was not only to create boundaries so you knew where freedom was, but it was to produce and to promote freedom. And the Pharisees had taken that and turned it into something that it wasn't supposed to be. It was all about what you can and cannot do. And you were judged based on a set of really self-imposed rules and regulations that God didn't intend. He intended it for freedom. And so that brings us to, what does that mean for us today, right? What does the Sabbath look like? What does it mean for us today? In Colossians, Paul's writing to the church, and he's talking about the fact that Jesus had just come and he'd given up his life for us. He'd paid the price for our sin, for our trespasses, our transgressions, all of our indebtedness that we couldn't pay, and that we were bound to the law and its legalism to try to be better. And Jesus came and freed us from that indebtedness. And so what happens is he goes on and says, because of this, that we just discussed in verse 16, he says, in light of the fact that Jesus brought us freedom and freedom from our indebtedness, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things which were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. And so these things are important. But what Paul is saying, because Jesus has freed us from this legalism and showed us that Christ is coming, that's what the law was meant to show us, that Christ was coming, and now he has come, right? It's not about the legalism of it. It was a foreshadowing of the benefit and the enjoyment. Because here's what is really interesting. We know Matthew chapter 5 through 7 as the Sermon on the Mount most commonly. And Jesus is teaching on a whole lot of topics in there. And partway through chapter 5, he addresses the issue of the law. And Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. He said, I didn't come to do away with this thing and to throw it away. I came to fulfill it. Now, for most of us, if we have a duty and we fulfill that duty, it means we've finished it, right? We've completed it. The problem is, that's not what the word fulfill means in this text. The word fulfill in the Greek meant to interpret correctly. So Jesus said, I didn't come to do away with the law and abolish it, but I came to interpret it correctly. These interactions that Jesus had with the Pharisees about healing and doing good on the Sabbath came after he said, I've come to interpret the law correctly. And then he proceeds to not only interpret the law correctly, but to model how the law should be interpreted correctly. And Jesus said, this day is about blessing, and it's about healing, and it's about freedom. This is what the Sabbath was intended to be. It is a holy day, and a holy day for doing good. Where the Pharisees sought to bring bondage and burden, Jesus brought freedom and life. In our culture, we all know that rest doesn't come naturally. We know that healthy eating doesn't come naturally, right? We know that a lot of things don't come naturally. And so we have to discipline ourselves, or we have to practice those things. Rest is one of those things that we need to practice. We're not automatically good at it. And when I say we need to practice rest, I'm not talking about being lazy. Lazy and rest are not the same things. You can't rest if you haven't done something. You can't rest if you haven't worked. You are resting from your work. It's not resting from identity. It's not resting from where you get your value. It's resting from a place of work because you know who your identity is and what your value is. And it's a cycle that God created us to rest from our work. And Steve talked about the fact that we work from a rest because it's not linear, it's cyclical. You work from rest, you rest from work. You work from rest, you rest from work. That is how God created the rhythm to be. So for us, we need to practice rest. Sometimes that might mean changing our routine because every day looks the same. There is no distinction between our 6 days of work and our day of rest. We do the same things in and out. We need to create a day that doesn't look like every other day. For some of us, that might mean we have a day where we wake up and we have no agenda for the day. Easier said than done, right? I have dozens of checklists on my phone for every area of my life. Do you know how hard it is for me to set this down and ignore my checklist for 24 hours? It can be painful. It can be painful because I don't understand it, right? Because maybe my value is from accomplishing my checklist. For some of us, we need to have a day where we just let the household chores go. Somebody's probably cringing right now at the thought of the kitchen piling up with dishes, right? And the laundry and all of the stuff overflowing. But if your seventh day looks like every other day, we're missing it. See, the Israelites were given manna 6 days that they were to collect. God gave them enough for the seventh day so that they didn't have to prepare. The whole principle of Sabbath rest for them was about not cooking because, let me tell you, we don't have to do much to eat our food today, right? But then it was such a labor. Most of their day was spent gathering, collecting, preparing, physically building a fire to cook. And we're not talking about going over and turning a knob or pushing a button. We're talking about rubbing sticks together after they gathered the firewood. For us, it's different. It was about not doing the household chores. And for us today, it's not that you don't prepare food maybe, but you just let the chores go. Now, for some of you that are struggling with that whole like a day without cleaning up after ourselves, it means you probably got to be a little bit more efficient on the other 6 days and stay on top of things, right? But that's about being productive and intentional so that when the rest day comes, I'm not stressed by it because I've planned for it, right? Maybe it's about attending a worship service together as a family. Maybe it's about serving together. Maybe it's about finding a way to do good and to get together and to do something for someone else, because Jesus said the Sabbath is about doing good. It's about bringing life. Anita and I watched the show Blue Bloods, and honestly, there's not a lot of TV shows that I can watch and say, I agree with everything, right? I mean, it has its good and bad, but one thing that I really appreciate the depiction of is this. Every Sunday, the family eats together. They don't live in the same household. They live all over New York City, and it's not like it's a 5-minute walk to Dad's house, right? They make an effort to come and be together if they're in town, and they eat together every Sunday. And so they have placed this value that's portrayed for us. How often do we sit and eat as a family? At our house, most of the time when we do, it happens by accident because we just happen to not be going in a bunch of different directions, right? Not because we intentionally set out and have something protected. Many of us use social media as our way that we think we just disconnect and unplug and that's our rest. Well, guess what? It's not. You might think I'm just going to mindlessly scroll and see what's going on and I'm disconnecting from all my stresses. Studies have shown that the use of social media actually introduces stress and anxiety to your body and to your mind because of these subtle fears that somebody else is doing this and I'm missing out on it. Or it makes you aware that some of your relationships are not as close as you thought they were because the connection is only through what I see on technology and not interpersonal face-to-face connection. Or somebody writes something that's just inflammatory and sets you off. You read bad news, right? They're not good. The average iPhone user touches their phone 2,617 times a day. Some of you are shocked by that. Some of you are saying, I don't touch mine anywhere near that. I might touch mine, a few hundred times a day. That means the person next to you is touching theirs 5,000 to make up for your average. Some of us are not honest with how much we touch our devices and how connected we are because our social media is on there. Our email is on there. And 7 days a week, I'm checking my work email when it can wait till Monday, right? If I read something that I don't need to read till tomorrow, am I in a state of rest? No, because I've already gone on how am I going to solve this problem. And if our email and our work-related stuff was on our computer and not on our phones, we probably wouldn't think about it because I don't want to go over and turn my computer on, right? I'm not going to do that. But because of the conveniences, it's right here. I'll just check it. It'll only take me a minute. And now my whole state of mind is gone. I'm going to encourage you, use your vacation days. You got to work on getting a day a week to rest and to do things differently. But if you have vacation and you're not using it, you're robbing yourself. You're not doing yourself any favors by working all that you can work. And you know what? I just let my vacation expire. That's how dedicated I am. Well, guess what? You're robbing your employer too. Your employer gives you vacation days because you need to rest and you need a break. And if you take your vacation days, you will be more productive and you will be a better employee for your boss. If you don't take your vacation days, you're robbing God of the way that He designed you to operate. You're robbing your family of extra time that they could be spending with you instead of you doing what you're doing that you feel is so important. That's more important than the relationships in your life because rest is made for relationship. So, a couple of questions, practical questions for you to ask yourself. Number one, when you think about what you're doing on your day of rest or your Sabbath or not doing, ask yourself, is this bringing you closer or pushing you away from God? Is this helping me in my relationship with God? Or is this something that is a barrier and it is something that is distracting from my relationship with God? Secondly, does it refresh you? Does it breathe life into you? Does it refresh you physically from a long week? Does it refresh you emotionally or mentally? Does it refresh you relationally? Because rest is meant to enhance your relationships. And does it refresh you spiritually? And thirdly, does it bring freedom? Does it bring freedom to you? Does it bring life? Does it bring hope? Does it bring health? Does it bring healing? That is what Sabbath was meant for. It is a gift to us so that we can have freedom and be better in our relationships. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you that not only have you introduced a principle of Sabbath and rest, but God, you modeled it for us. And no one can be more productive, more creative than you, but yet you still rest because you understand the value, because you created it. And I pray that we would heed the warnings of the children of Israel that you have given us in the Bible. I pray that we would heed the warnings of maybe some of our friends and family members or our own experiences where we've neglected this and we burn out. I pray that you would help us to trust you, that you're working when we're not, that you are faithful. And God, our value does not come from what we do, but it comes from who you are and who you've created us to be. I pray that we would rest in that principle, that we are enough and we don't need to prove it. Help us to trust you and help us to walk in your freedom, I pray. Bless each person that's here today, that each person that's watching online. Bless their families and their households, and may this principle of rest permeate their homes, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys for being here today. I'm gonna give you an encouragement. Go home and do nothing for the rest of the day. You have my permission. I don't care what you think you've got to do, it can wait. Go home and enjoy your friends, your family, the people that are around you. God bless you guys. Have a great day. If you're here for the first time, we want you to know that out in the lobby to the right, we have a VIP huddle, and we have some of our team that's waiting. Would love to just get to know you guys and just say thank you for being here. So God bless you guys. Thank you so much. See you next week.